I had planned the camping trip for weeks, thinking it would be a quiet escape from the constant noise of the city. I chose a remote spot in a national forest, a place far from the beaten paths that most hikers used. I wanted isolation, the kind of silence that pressed against your ears and made you feel like you were the only person left in the world. I didn't think much about how dangerous that could be. I only packed the essentials: a tent, a sleeping bag, enough food for 3 days, a portable stove, a water filter, a small first aid kit, and my backpack. My map and compass were tucked into an outer pocket, though I barely looked at them, confident in my ability to follow the trails. The first day of hiking was easy. The forest was alive with color. Trees stretched high, their leaves thick and dark green, creating a canopy that dappled the ground with sunlight. The air smelled of damp soil and pine. Birds called out above me, and small animals scurried through the underbrush. My feet made soft crunches on the thin layer of fallen leaves and twigs. Every so often, a deer would dart across the path, disappearing as quickly as it appeared. It felt peaceful in a way I hadn't experienced in years. By midday, I reached a small clearing near a stream. I decided to rest there, pull out some water, and eat a sandwich. The sound of water flowing over rocks was soothing. I dipped my hands in the cool water, splashed my face, and felt a brief surge of energy. As I sat there, I noticed the quiet was deeper than usual. The birds had mostly gone silent. Even the small rustles in the underbrush seemed distant. I shook off the unease, telling myself it was just the rhythm of nature. Sometimes, animals stop moving when they sense something different. I hiked until the sun was low in the sky, then chose a spot to set up my tent. It was on slightly higher ground, far enough from the stream to avoid flooding but still close enough to hear the water. The ground was uneven, with rocks and roots protruding, but I managed to clear enough space to pitch the tent. I hammered in the stakes, laid out my sleeping bag, and stacked my supplies neatly beside it. I always liked order. It gave me a sense of control. Once the tent was secure, I gathered some firewood. I had brought matches, but the wood was damp, and it took longer than I expected to get a fire going. Eventually, the flames flickered, and I sat close, feeling the heat against the cool evening air. Night fell fast. The forest became darker than I expected, almost unnatural. The canopy swallowed the remaining light, leaving only patches of moonlight that managed to slip through. The sounds of the forest changed. Insects buzzed closer to the firelight, and small animals rustled in the underbrush. Occasionally, there was a louder snap of a branch or a thud from deep in the woods. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was a deer or some small animal moving around. But every noise seemed sharper, closer, and more deliberate than I had imagined. I kept the fire burning longer than usual, feeding it small branches and twigs, until I was certain I couldn't hear anything approaching. I lay in my sleeping bag, staring at the mesh roof of the tent. The wind picked up and carried strange sounds, branches scraping against each other, leaves fluttering, and an occasional distant howl. My heart rate quickened. I had hiked alone many times, but never this far into the forest, never this isolated. I tried to calm myself by recalling survival tips. Keep the fire going, stay aware, stay quiet, conserve energy. But the sounds kept me tense. I slept lightly, if at all. Around midnight, I woke to a sharp sound. Something heavy had crashed near the edge of my clearing. My first instinct was to grab my flashlight and look. I fumbled for it, trying not to make noise. Outside the tent, the shadows moved strangely. Trees seemed to bend, or maybe it was my mind playing tricks in the firelight. The sound came again, a branch snapping. A heavy footfall? I froze, listening. There was silence for several long moments, then a rustling closer, almost around the edge of the firelight. I didn't move, hoping whatever it was would pass. But it didn't. The rustling circled the clearing slowly. I tried to make sense of it. Could it be a bear or some other predator? I hadn't seen any signs earlier, but now I wasn't so sure. I had a small bear spray in my pack, but I didn't want to leave the relative safety of my tent. I considered my options. I could get out and try to scare it away with a firebrand, but that was risky. I could try to make as little noise as possible and wait it out. I chose the latter. Every second stretched endlessly. The rustling continued, circling, pausing, testing boundaries. My fire burned low, and I added more twigs, hoping the light and warmth would give me some protection. Hours passed. I barely moved, my body stiff and tense. I kept my eyes on the shadows, ready to react if something lunged. Gradually, the sounds faded. By the first light of dawn, I emerged cautiously from my tent. The ground around the clearing had been disturbed. Footprints, large and heavy, marked the edges where I had heard the rustling. I recognized them from a guidebook, a bear. My stomach sank, realizing I had been entirely alone with it through the night. I packed up quickly, making as little noise as possible. Every snap of a twig underfoot made my heart leap. I kept the fire burning just long enough to signal to myself that I wasn't completely helpless. I drank some water from the stream, ate a small bite of food, and tried to calm my mind. The forest felt different now, alive in a threatening way. Every shadow seemed larger, every rustle louder. I moved carefully along the trail, scanning constantly for movement. As I hiked out, I passed areas where trees had been scratched and bark stripped, obvious bear markings. My sense of relief was mixed with anxiety. I realized that camping alone had exposed me to risks I hadn't truly understood until that night. I also felt a strange pride for having made it through without panicking or being hurt. By midday, I reached a point where the trees thinned, and I could see a dirt road in the distance. The feeling of isolation began to lift. I followed the road to the ranger station I had marked on my map. The forest behind me was silent now, but the memory of the night's sounds remained vivid. At the ranger station, I reported the bear activity. The ranger was unsurprised and reminded me that this part of the forest was known for bear encounters. They suggested I stick to more traveled trails in the future and never camp alone. I nodded, grateful for the advice, though my pride had taken a hit. The trip that I had imagined as peaceful and restorative had turned into a lesson in vigilance, awareness, and respect for the power of nature. Back in my car, I sat for a long time before driving away. I replayed every detail in my mind: the snapping of branches, the heavy rustling around the tent, the cold air pressing against my skin. I realized that fear isn't just about monsters or legends. It's about being small, exposed, and alone in a world that is indifferent to your safety. That night, I learned that survival depends on preparation, calm thinking, and respect for the wilderness. I also learned that relief is sweetest when it comes after a night spent entirely on edge, unsure if you would see the next dawn. By the time I reached the highway, I was tired, but I felt alive in a way I hadn't before. The forest had tested me and let me go. I had planned this solo camping trip for months, and I was more excited than I had ever been for anything in a long time. The forest I chose was deep and remote, miles from any paved road or small town. I wanted isolation, nothing but the sound of the wind in the trees and my own breathing. I packed carefully, making sure I had extra water, a sturdy tent, a good sleeping bag, enough food for 3 days, a first aid kit, and a small camping stove. I also packed a hatchet, a flashlight, extra batteries, a folding knife, and a whistle. I told myself that being prepared would keep me safe. The drive to the trailhead was long, winding through empty stretches of road, with only the occasional farmhouse or abandoned building breaking the monotony. By the time I arrived, the sun was already dipping behind the hills, and the forest was beginning to darken. I parked my old, battered car and double-checked my gear before heading into the trees. The trail was narrow, overgrown in places with roots and rocks sticking out. The air smelled sharp and fresh, the kind of smell that makes you feel alive. I hiked in a steady rhythm, my backpack snug against my shoulders, listening to the distant sounds of birds settling in for the night. After about an hour, I found a small clearing near a creek. It was perfect. The ground was level, covered with a thin layer of fallen leaves, and the creek provided water and the soothing sound of flowing water. I set up my tent carefully, making sure the stakes were tight and the rain flaps secured. I gathered some dry wood nearby, small branches and twigs for the fire. I managed to get it going with a few matches, and soon flames were dancing in the small circle of stones I had made. The firelight flickered against the trees, and I felt that calm satisfaction that comes from building something with your own hands. I cooked a simple dinner on my camping stove, a mix of rice and canned beans, seasoned with a small pack of spices I had brought along. I ate slowly, savoring the quiet and the solitude, feeling like I had escaped from the world entirely. By the time I finished, it was almost dark, and the forest had gone completely silent except for the creek and the occasional rustle of small animals in the underbrush. I sat by the fire for a while, watching sparks rise and disappear into the night, then crawled into my tent, zipped it closed, and turned on my flashlight to read the trail map one last time before sleep. It was around midnight when I first noticed something. At first, I thought it was my imagination, the way the shadows from the trees moved with the flicker of the firelight. But then I heard it, a distinct snap of a branch, close enough to make me freeze. I held my breath, straining my ears. Nothing, just the creak and the wind. I told myself it was probably a deer or some other small animal. I had spent enough time in the woods before to know that they could make unnerving sounds, especially at night. I tried to settle back into sleep, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching me. I lay awake for hours, hearing the occasional sound, another snap, the crunch of leaves, a distant rustle. Every time, I convinced myself it was an animal, but a small, growing sense of unease crept into my chest. I thought about hiking back to my car and driving home, but the idea of trudging through the dark forest alone was worse than staying put. I decided to wait until morning, telling myself I would leave first thing. The first light of dawn filtered through the trees, gray and weak. I crawled out of the tent, stiff from sleeping on the hard ground. I checked my surroundings. Nothing seemed out of place. The creek still flowed, and my fire had burned down to embers. I packed my tent and belongings carefully, trying to shake off the unease from the night. Then I heard it again, louder this time. Footsteps on dry leaves, approaching slowly from the far edge of the clearing. I froze, my heart hammering. I knew that in a place like this, it could be another hiker, maybe even someone like me. I grabbed my hatchet from the backpack, holding it loosely but ready. The footsteps paused, as if whoever it was had noticed me, then started moving again, circling the clearing. My stomach sank. The sound was deliberate, not random. Whoever it was, they were watching me. I quickly considered my options. Running through the forest could be dangerous. I knew I could easily trip and injure myself. Climbing a tree was possible, but I had nothing to secure myself with, and it would leave me vulnerable. I decided to make myself visible but keep a defensive stance. I stepped out from behind a tree, hatchet ready, and yelled, hoping the sound of my voice would be enough to scare off anyone with bad intentions. The footsteps stopped again. There was silence, the kind of silence that makes every tiny noise like a bird landing in a tree or the creek's babble feel deafening. Then I saw movement. A figure stepped into the clearing, partially hidden by the trees, just far enough away that I couldn't see details clearly. My mind raced. I kept my voice steady, repeating that I was not alone and that I would defend myself. The figure did not speak or wave. It just stood there, watching. My heart pounded so hard I was afraid it would give me away. Slowly, I backed toward my packed gear, keeping the figure in sight. I remembered the whistle in my pocket, the one I had brought in case of emergencies. I raised it and blew a long, loud blast. It echoed through the trees, and for a moment, nothing happened. Then the figure turned and ran, disappearing into the forest. I stayed frozen for a long time, catching my breath, scanning the trees for any sign that it would return. Eventually, the adrenaline subsided enough for me to gather my things and leave the clearing, walking quickly toward the trailhead. Every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves made me jump. It was one of the longest and most terrifying walks I have ever taken. I constantly glanced behind me, fearing the figure was following. After what felt like hours but was probably only half an hour, I reached my car. I locked the doors, checked all my gear, and sat inside, breathing heavily. I considered calling the police, but the trail was in a remote area with no cell service. I decided to drive slowly to the nearest town, careful not to draw attention but desperate to leave the forest. The drive was tense. Every shadow on the side of the road made me tense, expecting the figure to appear. I passed a few farmhouses, and at the first gas station, I pulled in, bought water, and reported the incident to the clerk. The small town police station was nearby, and I explained what happened. They promised to send a patrol to check the trail, though they explained that these kinds of areas often attracted people who liked to scare campers, and catching them was difficult. I stayed in town that night, sleeping in a motel with the lights on, double-locking the door. Over the next few days, I kept checking the news and local reports. There were accounts of similar incidents in the same forest, hikers and campers being approached by unknown individuals, usually avoiding confrontation but leaving them shaken. The police managed to apprehend a few suspects who admitted to following and frightening campers, but the ones responsible for my encounter were never found. The experience left a lasting impression on me. I learned that preparation wasn't just about packing gear. It was about being mentally ready for the unexpected. I realized that isolation could be dangerous, that a serene forest could hide real threats, and that human beings were sometimes the most frightening part of nature. I still camp, but now I never go alone, and I stay on trails that are well-trafficked. I always keep my phone charged, my whistle and hatchet accessible, and I trust my instincts if something feels off. What stayed with me the most, though, was the memory of those silent footsteps circling the clearing, watching me as I slept, and the way the forest, which had seemed peaceful and inviting, could suddenly feel so threatening. It taught me to respect the wilderness, yes, but also to respect the reality that in remote places, you are not just at the mercy of the environment, you are at the mercy of others as well. I had always loved camping. There was something about leaving the city behind, the constant noise and artificial lights, and going deep into the woods where everything was natural, raw, and unfiltered. I had spent years learning to survive in the wilderness, honing my skills with a backpack, a tent, a small stove, and a knife. That knowledge had never really been tested in a truly dangerous situation, and I had thought I was careful, methodical, and prepared for anything. I had made a plan to spend a week alone in a remote national forest far from any roads, towns, or other campers. It was early September, and the weather was still warm in the daytime but chilly at night. I wanted solitude. I wanted the real forest, not just a campsite full of people shouting and leaving trash behind. I started my hike early in the morning, the sun low in the sky and the air crisp. My backpack was heavy, packed with essentials. Food for a week, a water filter, my tent, sleeping bag, a first aid kit, extra clothes, and tools for survival. I had a small map, but I preferred to rely on my instincts and experience. The trail was narrow, winding through tall pines and dense underbrush. Every so often, A bird would call or a squirrel would leap from branch to branch, and I felt a familiar thrill. I was finally alone. By midday, I had hiked for nearly 6 hours. My legs were tired, but I was moving at a steady pace, scanning the trees for anything unusual. I drank from my water bottle and had a small snack of dried fruit and nuts. The forest around me was quiet, not just peaceful but heavy with a kind of stillness that made me alert. I found a small clearing by a stream and decided to set up camp. It was perfect. Flat ground, some fallen logs for seating, and access to water. I unpacked my tent, staked it into the soil, and built a small fire pit from rocks I found nearby. I chopped a bit of wood to get a fire going and took a moment to sit, letting the sunlight warm my back. As I prepared my small meal of instant rice and dried meat, I noticed something strange. The forest, which had been mostly quiet and calm, suddenly seemed louder in a subtle way. Leaves rustled more than before, the wind carried the distant crack of branches snapping, and every so often, a sharp noise echoed from deeper in the woods. It wasn't the sound of animals I knew. I brushed it off at first, telling myself it was just the wind or maybe deer moving through the underbrush. That evening, after dark, the forest became a different place entirely. I built a larger fire and sat close to it, my knife within reach, my flashlight nearby. The shadows were long and deep, and every sound seemed magnified. I could hear animals moving, but there were other noises too. Footsteps or something dragging across leaves far enough away that I couldn't identify it clearly. I stayed calm, reminding myself that wild animals were curious but usually avoided humans. I kept my fire bright and made sure my tent was secure. Around midnight, the first serious scare happened. I was dozing lightly by the fire when I heard a sound, low and deliberate, coming from the woods. It was too big to be a small animal, something heavy moving, careful but not stealthy. My heart rate went up, and I quietly reached for my flashlight. I shined it toward the trees, and for a moment, I saw movement. A large figure hunched, moving slowly, almost stalking. I froze. I didn't make a sound. I knew I wasn't dealing with a human necessarily, but it was big enough to be dangerous, a bear or possibly a mountain lion. I slowly got to my feet and grabbed a piece of firewood, not knowing whether I was going to defend myself or scare it away. The figure retreated a bit, disappearing into the darkness, and I let out a shaky breath. I spent the rest of the night sitting near the fire, listening to the forest. Every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves made me jump. I didn't sleep much, only dozing in short bursts. By dawn, the forest felt different again, alive, but not threatening. The sun came up, painting the trees gold, and I convinced myself that the danger was only temporary. I packed my fire, cleaned up, and considered moving to a different clearing to avoid any potential predators that might be lingering. I hiked deeper into the woods, staying close to the stream. The terrain grew rougher, steeper hills, loose rocks, and fallen trees. I had to be careful with every step. My mind kept replaying the figure from the night before. It had been too deliberate to be an accident. Something had been watching me. I wondered if it had been a human, someone camping illegally or hunting in the area, or a wild animal. My training kicked in. Stay alert, make noise when moving, don't surprise anything, keep your presence known. By late afternoon, I found another spot, even more isolated, with a small clearing surrounded by thick trees. I set up camp again, but this time I was more methodical. I built the fire pit larger and cleared more ground around it, making it impossible for something to sneak up unnoticed. I created a perimeter with rocks and sticks that would make noise if anything moved through them. I checked my knife and the small folding saw I had, feeling a grim sense of necessity. Night fell again. This time, I didn't just sit by the fire. I circled my campsite with a flashlight, checking for anything unusual. That's when I saw it. Footprints. Large, deep, and not human. The prints led from the treeline to the edge of my clearing, stopping just short of my tent. I examined them, trying to identify the animal. The size and shape suggested a bear. My stomach sank. I had read about people getting into trouble with bears, and even experienced hikers were cautious. I reinforced my food storage, hanging my bag from a tree with a rope so a bear couldn't reach it. The night after that was tense. I stayed awake almost the entire time, sitting by the fire, listening to the sounds of the forest. Every hour, I could hear the bear moving around my campsite, sniffing, sometimes knocking over small branches or rocks. I didn't move, didn't make any sudden noises. I felt my heart beat in my chest, a heavy, slow thump. I reminded myself constantly to stay calm, to not panic. In the morning, I decided to break camp. I knew that staying put would be too dangerous. I packed quietly, taking care to remove all food traces, and started hiking back along the stream, moving carefully but steadily. The forest was quiet during the day, but I kept my eyes open for signs of the bear or anything else that might be dangerous. I kept my knife ready, my senses alert, and my pace steady. By late afternoon, I reached a wider trail, one that led toward the main forest road. I felt relief washing over me. The forest was still, but I knew I had outlasted the immediate danger. I hadn't seen the bear in the daylight, and I stayed calm enough to avoid drawing its attention. I thought back to the nights I had spent alone, tense, alert, and surviving. I realized that camping wasn't just about enjoying nature. It was about respecting it, understanding it, and being prepared to face real risks. When I finally saw the road and the distant sound of cars, I felt a mix of exhaustion and triumph. I had survived, fully aware of the dangers, and had done so because I remained vigilant, patient, and careful. I took a deep breath, letting the air of the forest fill my lungs one last time before leaving. I had learned more about myself and about the wilderness than I had anticipated. I had faced fear, real fear, and had emerged unscathed, with a deeper respect for the wild. I stopped just before the road, looked back at the trees, and felt a strange connection to the forest. It was alive, unpredictable, and unforgiving, but also beautiful and essential. I knew I would return one day, but I would do so with even more caution, knowledge, and respect. I had survived this trip, fully aware that it could have gone badly wrong in an instant. That sense of accomplishment, the clarity of knowing that fear had been faced and controlled, stayed with me long after I reached my car and drove back towards civilization. By the time I reached my home, I was exhausted but calm. I unpacked slowly, took a long shower, and prepared a simple meal, feeling grateful for warmth, safety, and the normalcy of human life. That night, I slept soundly, knowing I had tested my limits and survived. I had been planning this solo camping trip for months. I needed a break from everything: work, city life, the constant noise and pressure. I wanted to go somewhere completely isolated, where no one could reach me and I could just disappear into nature for a while. I packed my backpack meticulously, checking and double-checking my gear. Tent, sleeping bag, stove, extra fuel, food, water, first aid kit, knife, rope, flashlight, batteries, compass, map, and a small solar charger. I wanted to be ready for everything, or so I thought. I chose a remote area in a national forest several hours from the nearest town. It wasn't a popular camping spot. I found it by studying old maps online, looking for places that had trails but weren't crowded. I didn't want anyone around. I drove all day, following winding, narrow roads that eventually turned into dirt tracks. At some point, I couldn't drive any further without risking getting stuck, so I parked my car and continued on foot, carrying my backpack, which was heavier than I remembered but manageable. The forest was dense. The trees were tall, thick, and close together. The sunlight barely reached the ground in some spots. The smell of pine and damp earth was strong, and the quiet was absolute. There was no wind, no birds, barely a sound at all, which made every small noise I made feel amplified. I followed a faint trail, moving carefully, watching for roots and rocks that could trip me. My heart was pounding, not from fear, but from the exertion and the sense of being completely alone. After hours of hiking, I found a small clearing. It was perfect, not too big, but enough space to set up my tent. A small creek ran nearby, providing water. I gathered firewood from the surrounding forest, dry sticks and branches that had fallen naturally. I set up my tent, arranged my sleeping bag inside, and built a small fire pit with stones around it. As I worked, I felt a strange tension building. I couldn't explain why, but the forest felt alive in a way that was almost too aware of me. I shook it off. It was just my imagination. Night fell faster than I expected. I lit a small fire, just enough to keep the immediate area lit and to cook my dinner. I ate slowly, savoring the quiet, the crackle of the fire, and the smell of smoke mingling with pine. Once my food was gone, I washed my small pan in the creek, careful to avoid leaving any trace. I went to sleep early, exhausted from the hike and the weight of the pack. I fell asleep to the sound of the creek and the occasional crack of wood in the forest. I woke in the middle of the night to a strange sound. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a bear walking far away. But the sound was too deliberate, too consistent, a slow, dragging shuffle through the leaves, moving closer. My heart began to race. I stayed perfectly still in my sleeping bag, listening. The fire had died down to glowing embers. The shadows of the trees stretched across the clearing, and in the dim moonlight, I thought I saw movement near the edge of the clearing. I told myself it was probably a raccoon or something similar. I had read about animals coming into campsites at night, but the sound didn't make sense. It was heavier than an animal, and it stopped when I stopped moving, as if it was aware of me. My stomach dropped. I fumbled quietly for my flashlight and turned it on. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees, the underbrush, the creek, but nothing moved. I felt exposed. I could see the forest, but I couldn't see anything beyond the small circle of light, and the shadows beyond were unnervingly deep. I decided to get up and make a larger fire. I slipped out of my tent slowly, trying not to make noise, and arranged more wood on the embers. I struck a match, and the fire caught, sending sparks up into the night. The light revealed the clearing more clearly, but the forest beyond the firelight still seemed to move in the corner of my vision. I told myself I was imagining things, that it was just shadows and my own nerves. Then I heard a different sound, the sound of twigs breaking in a pattern, deliberate, too precise to be random. It wasn't just movement, it was methodical. Something was walking toward me. I froze, flashlight in hand. The sound stopped abruptly, as if whoever or whatever it was aware I had noticed. The hair on my arms stood up. My mind raced through every possibility: animal, another hiker, someone dangerous. But the nearest road was miles away. Nobody else should be here. I decided to make noise, hoping it would scare whatever it was off. I picked up a rock and threw it toward the forest. The sound echoed, and I heard something move back. I exhaled slowly, my body shaking, and tried to focus on the fire. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of being stalked. I stayed by the fire until the embers were bright and crackling, then returned to my tent, keeping my knife on my chest. I didn't sleep again that night. Every small sound made me jump: the wind through the trees, the creek, the occasional snap of a branch. I tried to convince myself it was normal, that the forest was just alive with noises. But it didn't feel normal. By dawn, I was exhausted, my eyes sore from staring into the dark all night. In the morning, I packed my small cooking items and went for a cautious walk along the creek. I wanted to get water and make sure no one had approached my campsite. That's when I noticed something. My tent had small scratches along one side, barely noticeable, like claws but not from an animal I knew. And there were footprints in the dirt around the clearing, not animal tracks. Human footprints, but they weren't familiar. They were large, heavy, and messy, like someone had walked here in a hurry. My stomach sank. I decided I had to leave. I packed everything quickly, scanning the forest constantly. As I moved along the trail, I kept looking over my shoulder. The forest, once peaceful, now felt menacing. Every rustle in the underbrush set me on edge. I kept my knife ready and my flashlight easily accessible, even though it was daylight. Hours passed as I hiked toward the dirt road where I had left my car. My legs were sore, my backpack heavy, but the fear kept me moving faster than I might normally have managed. I stayed alert, every sense heightened. The forest seemed endless, twisting and turning. At one point, I thought I saw movement behind a tree, something crouching. I stopped, heart hammering, but when I shined my flashlight, it was gone. Finally, I reached the road. Relief washed over me. I ran the last few meters, sliding into the driver's seat of my car. My hands were trembling as I started the engine. I didn't look back as I drove out of the forest, the trees blurring past. My mind kept replaying the night, the sounds, the scratches, the footprints. I couldn't explain who or what had been there, but I didn't want to. I had survived, and that was enough. Once I reached the nearest town, I stopped at a diner, shaking, exhausted, and ordered coffee and food. I thought about calling the forest rangers, but I decided not to. There was no evidence beyond the scratches and the footprints, and I didn't want to relive it by reporting it. I needed to recover and return to normal life. Over the next few days, I recovered physically, but the memory of the night stayed with me. I kept replaying the small details, the slow shuffle of feet, the pause when I shined the flashlight, the sense of someone or something watching me. I realized that nature could be unpredictable, and isolation made it more intense. I knew I had to be more careful next time. I made a promise to myself. I would still go camping, still explore, but never alone in a place so remote without letting someone know exactly where I was and when I would return. The experience changed me. I respected the wilderness more, appreciated the small comforts of civilization, and learned that fear was as real as the trees, the creek, and the dirt under my feet. I survived the night because I stayed calm, stayed alert, and never let myself give in to panic. And while I never discovered exactly what had been there, I carried the lesson forward. Some dangers are silent, patient, and unseen, but with preparation, caution, and respect, survival is possible. I had planned this camping trip for months, obsessively checking maps, weather reports, and trail conditions. I wanted a weekend alone in the wilderness, away from people, away from noise, away from everything that felt suffocating in my normal life. I had packed meticulously. A sturdy tent, a sleeping bag rated for low temperatures, extra layers of clothing, a backpack heavy with food, water, a first aid kit, a multi-tool, a headlamp, and a compass. I even packed a small camping stove and a stack of firewood I had collected over the week before leaving. I had convinced myself that I was prepared for anything, that I could handle solitude and whatever nature threw at me. I arrived at the trailhead early in the morning. The air was crisp, the kind that fills your lungs and makes you feel awake in a way city air never can. I started my hike with excitement coursing through me, the gravel crunching under my boots as I moved deeper into the forest. The trail was narrow and overgrown in parts, with thick underbrush brushing against my legs. Birds called occasionally from the trees, and I could hear the distant rush of a river I had passed on the map. The sun filtered through the trees in golden shafts, casting long shadows that moved as the branches swayed. I had planned to hike 6 miles before setting up camp. The day was slow but enjoyable. I took breaks often, stopping to drink water and snack on trail mix. I noticed the smell of damp earth and pine resin, a scent that made the world feel ancient and alive. The forest floor was uneven, roots twisting across the trail, rocks jutting out in places. Every step required attention, which helped keep my mind from wandering too far into anxious thoughts. By the afternoon, I found a small clearing next to a creek that I had noticed on the map. The spot was ideal. Flat ground for the tent, a source of water, and some fallen logs I could use for a fire. I set my pack down and began unpacking, carefully arranging my gear. I pitched the tent, making sure the stakes were secure and the rainfly tight. I collected dry kindling and small logs to start a fire. As I worked, I noticed the forest around me seemed unusually quiet. The birds were still, and even the breeze had stilled. I brushed it off, telling myself the forest had its own rhythms and that nothing unusual was happening. By the time the sun was low, the sky streaked with pink and orange. I had a fire going and had cooked a small meal on the camping stove. I ate slowly, savoring the quiet, the isolation, and the sense of being far from everyone else. The forest had a weight to it, a stillness that pressed in on me, but I welcomed it. I told myself I needed this silence. Night came quickly, the temperature dropped, and I wrapped myself tightly in my sleeping bag, laying next to the dying fire to absorb some heat. The shadows around the clearing grew long and dark, shapes forming in the flickering light that my mind tried to interpret. I kept telling myself they were just trees and logs, nothing more. The sound of water from the creek was soothing, almost hypnotic, lulling me into a half-sleep. Then I heard it, a rustling in the underbrush, faint at first, then louder. I froze, every muscle tensing. My first thought was a deer or a small animal, but the rustling moved in a pattern that felt deliberate, not random. Leaves cracked and twigs snapped in a sequence that suggested something larger than a deer. I listened carefully, trying to identify the sound. I circled the clearing, moving closer, stopping, then moving again. My heart raced, and I realized I had made one critical mistake. I had not hung my food. I had left my small stash on a flat rock near my tent. I knew bears were in this region, but I told myself it was unlikely one would come this close. Still, fear settled in my stomach like a stone. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it toward the sound. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the underbrush, but I saw nothing. The rustling stopped. I held my breath, straining my ears. A low, guttural noise echoed from somewhere in the shadows. Not a growl exactly, but a warning, a sound that told me the animal knew I was there and was assessing me. I realized I had two choices: try to stay calm in the tent or attempt to scare it away. I stayed in the tent, shaking slightly, trying to make myself appear small and uninteresting. The rustling returned, closer now, circling the tent in a deliberate manner. My hands gripped my flashlight and a sturdy hiking stick. Every instinct in my body screamed that if I made a sound, if I moved carelessly, I could provoke it. The night stretched on in unbearable tension. The rustling and low sounds came and went, each wave of movement raising my heart rate higher than the last. I was acutely aware of every noise: the snapping of a twig under my weight, the hiss of the fire as the flames consumed the logs, the movement of wind in the treetops. Time became distorted. Minutes felt like hours. I kept reminding myself that bears were mostly cautious of humans, but caution did little to ease my terror as I imagined it breaking through the tent. Around midnight, the rustling stopped. The forest returned to a quiet that felt heavier than before. I stayed awake for the next few hours, listening. I could hear the creek, the occasional hoot of an owl, and then, at one point, something moving through the leaves far off. I couldn't see it, but I could feel its presence. My mind raced with every scenario, from the worst case to the implausible, trying to predict what might happen. The cold seeped into me, chilling my bones. I had underestimated the night temperature and the wind that had picked up. I tried to adjust my sleeping bag, stuffing clothes into gaps, using my pack as insulation. I tried to keep the fire going, feeding it small twigs, but the larger logs had burned down. Smoke curled from the dying embers, the smell mixing with the damp forest air. My stomach growled, but fear made it impossible to eat. Morning came slowly, pale light filtering through the trees. I was exhausted, my body tense and sore. I unzipped the tent cautiously, scanning the area. Everything looked as it had when I set up camp except my food. The rock where I had left my stash was overturned, and remnants of my granola bars and dried fruit were scattered. I felt a mixture of relief and terror. Relief that I was unharmed, terror at how close danger had come. I decided not to stay another night. I packed quickly, checking the forest constantly as I moved. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made me jump. I avoided the creek, taking a less obvious trail back to the main path. I moved carefully, deliberately, aware of every sound and shadow. The hike back felt longer than the hike in, every step heavy with the memory of the previous night. By late afternoon, I reached the trailhead. The sight of cars and other campers, the noise, the smells of asphalt and human activity hit me like a wave. Relief washed through me in a physical way, as though I had been carrying a weight I hadn't realized. I drank water, ate a sandwich from my backpack, and sat for a long time before starting the drive home. At home, I unpacked my gear carefully. The sleeping bag, tent, and stove went into storage. I marked the experience in my mind as a lesson in preparation, caution, and respect for the wilderness. I realized that fear, in its purest form, could sharpen awareness and survival instincts, but it also demanded humility. Nature had no malice, but it had rules I could not control. That night, I slept deeply, exhausted but alive, grateful for the clarity that comes from facing danger without succumbing to it. In the weeks that followed, I planned another trip. I studied bear behavior, learned to hang food properly, practiced fire management, and memorized emergency procedures. My next trip would be different. I would be smarter, more cautious, and better prepared. But I would never forget that night. The darkness, the sounds, the weight of being entirely alone in a forest that did not care whether I lived or died. Nature is unforgiving, and yet it teaches. I had survived because I respected it, because I remained calm despite fear, and because I was willing to let instinct guide me when my mind screamed panic. I had always thought of myself as someone who could handle the outdoors. I had done a few weekend trips, mostly in well-trafficked parks where I could hear other campers and the distant hum of cars or hikers on trails. But I wanted more than that. I wanted isolation, the kind of solitude where I could test myself, where the only sounds were the wind, the rustle of leaves, and the occasional snap of a branch underfoot. I had scoured maps, guides, and online forums for somewhere that few people ventured. That's how I found the backcountry section of Deepwood Forest, a stretch of dense trees, uneven terrain, and rocky outcrops far from the nearest trailhead. It was perfect, or so I thought. I set out early on a Friday morning. My backpack was heavy but manageable, stuffed with dehydrated meals, a sturdy tent, a sleeping bag, a first aid kit, water filtration system, and other essential gear. I had checked the weather multiple times and packed accordingly, confident I had prepared for anything. The drive alone took hours, winding through small towns, farmland, and eventually a road that ended in a narrow dirt path that seemed barely used. I parked my car, double-checked my map and compass and started walking. At first, the hike was peaceful. The sunlight filtered through tall pine and oak trees, creating shifting patterns on the forest floor. I could hear birds and squirrels, the occasional distant snap of a twig indicating a deer or fox passing by. The terrain was uneven, with roots jutting from the ground and rocks hidden under a layer of fallen leaves. I had to focus constantly to avoid tripping. The solitude felt good at first, exhilarating even. There were no cell towers out here, no road noise, just me and the forest. As I walked deeper, the forest seemed to grow older and wilder. The trees were closer together, their branches entwined, and the undergrowth thickened. I had to push aside ferns and low branches to keep moving. I noticed the air growing cooler and damper, a smell of damp earth and decaying leaves filling my nose. I reminded myself that the forest was alive, full of creatures I might never see, but everything so far had seemed manageable. I was confident, perhaps a little too confident. I reached my planned campsite just before sunset. It was on a slight ridge overlooking a small creek, hidden enough to feel private but with a flat enough surface to set up my tent. I cleared the area of sticks and rocks, setting up my tent meticulously. I strung a rope to hang my food away from animals and laid out my sleeping bag. The sun was dipping below the horizon, and shadows spread across the forest, darkening the already thick undergrowth. I started a small fire, the flames crackling and giving off a comforting glow. I cooked my freeze-dried meal, ate quietly, and cleaned up. Everything felt right, safe, routine. As night fell, the forest changed. The comforting sounds of the evening, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of owls shifted subtly. I realized I could hear heavier steps sometimes, or the occasional crack of a larger branch breaking. My mind tried to rationalize. A deer, a raccoon, a fox. Nothing more. I checked my surroundings, scanning the tree line around my campsite. Nothing. The shadows from my fire flickered, making shapes in the trees that could have been anything. I reminded myself I was trained, alert, and careful. This was still just nature. But then I noticed the first sign of something off. My food bag, which I had hung carefully from a rope, had been slightly tugged. Not completely down, just moved. I froze, listening. Nothing. I checked the area thoroughly, scanning for tracks or signs of animals. There were some paw prints, small, indistinct, probably a raccoon. But I had hung the bag well above the ground. Something had clearly tried to get it. I made adjustments, moving my bag higher, tying it tighter, checking my rope knots. My heart rate increased, not with fear, but with awareness. This was wilderness. This was unpredictable. I slept lightly, one ear open to the sounds around me. Around midnight, I woke to something else. The night was quiet, too quiet. No wind, no birds, no rustling of smaller creatures. And then I heard it, a heavier sound, like something large moving slowly just beyond my firelight. My first thought was a bear. I reached for my flashlight and shined it around, scanning the darkness. Nothing, just the trees, shadows twisting and swaying. But the sound didn't stop. It moved slowly, deliberately. The snapping of branches was uneven, almost cautious. I considered the bear spray in my pack, my knife, the fire. I stayed still, breathing quietly, trying to listen. Minutes passed, and I realized the sound was circling my campsite. I felt my stomach tighten. The firelight stretched over the ground, revealing nothing, yet the noises persisted. The creature was intelligent, deliberate, not random. My mind raced. What could it be? Bears usually didn't circle like this. They were curious but not methodical. Could it be a human? Lost? Armed? Dangerous? I gripped my flashlight tighter, trying to suppress panic. I didn't move, didn't make a sound, and waited. Hours felt like an eternity. Eventually, the noises faded. I didn't sleep after that, just watched, alert, waiting for dawn. The first light was a relief, pale and weak, but enough to give me confidence. I could see my surroundings clearly. No tracks other than the usual animal paths, no movement in the trees. Still, the night had changed something. I packed slowly, deliberately, checking every piece of gear, making sure everything was secure. I started hiking out, sticking to the creek as a natural guide. The forest was quiet, eerily quiet, and I kept glancing over my shoulder. I kept thinking I saw movement just beyond the treeline, but each time there was nothing. By late morning, I found a small clearing where the sunlight reached the forest floor more fully. I paused to drink water and check my map. I realized how lost I might have been if I had ignored the small deviations in the trail I had taken the night before. I had no cell signal, no backup plan beyond my instincts and maps. Every step reminded me that I had underestimated the forest. I moved carefully, noting landmarks, the creek, a particular bend in a large fallen tree, to orient myself. The air was warmer now, and I could hear birds again, small relief from the terror of the previous night. By late afternoon, I reached the edge of a logging road. My pace quickened, relief flooding me. From there, it was a short hike to where I had parked my car. I thought about what had circled my campsite, the heavy footsteps in the night. I never saw it, never had concrete proof, but I didn't need proof to know it had been real. A bear? Possibly. A human? Maybe. Something else entirely? I didn't want to know. I had survived. I had been cautious, alert, and prepared enough to avoid confrontation. That was all that mattered. Driving home, the adrenaline started to fade, replaced by exhaustion and a deep sense of relief. I reflected on the experience, recognizing that my confidence had been naive, that the wilderness was not something to conquer, only to respect. I would go back to camping, certainly, but not like this. Never without extra measures, extra precautions, extra awareness. That night had been a wake-up call, brutal in its subtlety, but I had come out intact. I reached home and unpacked slowly, double-checking everything I had used. I washed myself thoroughly, ate a proper meal, and sat quietly. The fear had left, replaced by the kind of profound awareness that only comes from confronting danger and surviving it. My body relaxed for the first time in 48 hours, and I slept deeply that night, free of nightmares. I knew the forest would always be there, unpredictable and wild, but I had learned how to respect it and survive it. That was a victory in itself. The experience left a permanent mark on me, not in fear, but in humility. I realized I had underestimated the raw, indifferent power of nature, and that even the smallest lapse in awareness could turn a simple camping trip into a dangerous ordeal. From that point on, I never treated the wilderness lightly. I planned meticulously, always carried extra safety gear, and never ignored even the smallest sign that something wasn't right. It was mid-September when I decided to go on a solo camping trip. I had been planning it for months, meticulously mapping out the trail, researching the area, and preparing my gear. I wanted isolation, a chance to disconnect from the city, the noise, the people. I packed my backpack with all the essentials: tent, sleeping bag, stove, food, water, first aid, extra clothes. I even packed more than I thought I would need, because in my mind, being underprepared was not an option. The weather forecast had predicted clear skies and mild temperatures, perfect for a few days out in the wilderness. I arrived at the trailhead early in the morning. The sun was barely over the horizon, casting a soft orange glow on the trees. The parking lot was empty except for a few vehicles, and the air smelled like wet earth and pine. I strapped on my pack and began walking, feeling the familiar tension in my shoulders ease as the city faded behind me. The trail was narrow at first, winding through thick forest, and the sound of my boots crunching over leaves and twigs was the only noise for miles. Birds chirped occasionally, and a light breeze stirred the tops of the trees. For the first few hours, the hike was peaceful. The trail was marked and maintained, though parts of it were rugged, with exposed roots and rocks that forced me to pay close attention to each step. I came across a small creek, clear and shallow, the water running over smooth stones. I stopped to refill my water bottle and wash my hands. Everything felt normal, almost serene, like nothing could go wrong out here. By midday, I reached a plateau that overlooked a valley. The view was breathtaking, rolling hills covered in a mix of pine and deciduous trees, the colors of early fall starting to appear, yellows and oranges breaking up the green. I sat down on a rock to rest and eat a small lunch, enjoying the silence and the feeling of being completely alone. I resumed hiking after lunch, following the trail deeper into the forest. The path began to narrow, and the terrain became steeper and more uneven. I could hear the occasional rustle of small animals in the underbrush, but there was no sign of people. I passed a series of rocky outcroppings and a fallen log that had been turned into a makeshift bridge over a muddy dip in the trail. It all seemed manageable, though I could feel my muscles tiring. By late afternoon, I started looking for a campsite. I had planned to stop at a particular area near a small pond, but when I arrived, I realized it was taken by a group I hadn't noticed earlier. I didn't want to backtrack too far, so I decided to keep going and find another spot. The trail became less defined, more overgrown, and I had to push aside branches and brush to move forward. I noticed the sun was lower in the sky, and the forest started to cast longer shadows. I picked up my pace, wanting to find a campsite before dark. After about another hour, I found a small clearing next to a stand of trees. It was far enough from the trail to be private, flat enough to pitch my tent, and with enough fallen branches to start a fire. I set up my tent quickly, careful to hammer the stakes in tightly because I knew the ground would harden as the night cooled. I gathered firewood, small sticks first to get the fire going, then larger logs to keep it burning through the night. Once the fire was lit, I cooked some dinner on my portable stove and sat close to the fire, listening to the sounds of the forest. Nightfall came quickly. The forest became darker than I expected. The only light came from my fire and the stars above, which were clearer and brighter than I had ever seen them in the city. I felt a sense of contentment sitting there, the crackling of the fire comforting. But as the night deepened, I began to notice subtle noises that made me uneasy. Twigs snapping at a distance, the rustle of leaves as if something was moving just beyond the firelight. At first, I tried to rationalize it, telling myself it was deer or small animals, but the sounds seemed deliberate, moving closer. I packed my food away and extinguished the fire, thinking I might be able to sleep and that the noises would go away. I lay in my tent, listening. The forest was alive with the sounds of nocturnal animals, but there was something different tonight. A pattern to the sounds, almost like someone or something was moving around the perimeter of the clearing. I tried to convince myself it was impossible, that it was just animals, but my heart rate started to rise. Then I heard it. A sharp, deliberate snap of a branch, much closer than before. I froze. My mind raced, considering what could be out there. I had brought bear spray, but that wouldn't help if it was a human intruder. I whispered to myself, telling myself I was imagining things, but I knew the sound had come from less than 20 feet away. The forest suddenly felt oppressive, the dark much heavier than before. I reached for my flashlight and clicked it on, sweeping the beam around the tent, but I saw nothing. The noises stopped after that, but the feeling of being watched didn't. Every small sound, the wind in the trees, the rustle of leaves, made me flinch. I tried to sleep, but I barely closed my eyes before jerking awake to every sound. Hours passed this way. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps right outside my tent. I froze, holding my breath, straining to hear. Then a low groan, almost human, came from the direction of the trees. I realized I had left a small pocket knife in my pocket, and I gripped it tightly. I considered leaving the tent, but it was pitch dark, and I had no idea if whatever was out there would attack. By dawn, I was exhausted but alive. I unzipped the tent slowly, trying to make as little noise as possible, and peered outside. The clearing was empty. Nothing moved except for the small birds beginning to chirp. I saw no signs of animals large enough to make the sounds from the night before, but I noticed something unsettling. Footprints in the mud around the edge of the clearing, large, human-like, heading in the direction of the trail I had come from. Whoever or whatever had been out there had not left a trace of moving through the forest, but these prints were clear, deliberate, and frighteningly close. I packed up quickly, checking the tent and my gear to make sure nothing had been disturbed. The sense of urgency pushed me forward, my nerves still raw from the previous night. I took a different route than the one I had hiked in on, hoping to avoid the person who had been following me. My pace was fast, my eyes scanning constantly for any movement. The forest felt completely different in daylight, more open, less threatening, yet I couldn't shake the memory of the sounds from the night before. By mid-morning, I finally reached a junction with another trail that would lead back to the main road. Relief washed over me, though it was tempered by exhaustion and lingering fear. I walked briskly, ears alert, scanning every shadow, listening for any unusual sounds. The trail eventually opened up to a wide, gravel path that led to a small ranger station. I saw cars parked nearby and people walking dogs. I felt the first real sense of safety in nearly 24 hours. At the ranger station, I told the rangers what had happened. They listened, nodding seriously, noting the location of the footprints. They told me there had been reports of other hikers experiencing similar things in that area, strange encounters that suggested someone had been watching or following people. They assured me that patrols would investigate, and they advised me never to hike alone in that part of the forest again. I drove home slowly, my body still tense, my mind replaying every sound, every shadow from the night before. It took days before I could stop imagining movement in the corners of my eyes, but I tried to remind myself that I had made it through. No one had attacked me. I was alive. I had trusted my instincts, stayed alert, and acted cautiously. I had always loved the idea of camping alone. There was something about stepping away from the constant hum of the city, leaving behind notifications and deadlines, and immersing myself entirely in nature that felt like cleansing my mind. I wanted to test myself, to see if I could survive on my own for a few days in the wilderness. I chose a place that wasn't very popular, a small patch of forest on the edge of a national park, a spot that looked perfect on the map but that I knew few people visited. I packed my gear meticulously: a tent, sleeping bag, food for 4 days, water purification tablets, a sturdy backpack, a first aid kit, a compass, and a map. I even brought extra batteries for my flashlight and my phone, though I knew service would be minimal. The drive there was long but scenic. The road narrowed as I approached the forest, the trees growing closer together until the sun barely penetrated the canopy. I parked in a small dirt clearing, checked my gear one last time, and started walking into the woods. From the start, the silence was striking. It wasn't just the absence of cars or humans. Even the birds seemed few, and the wind whispered through the branches instead of rushing loudly. I followed a faint trail that led deeper into the forest, my boots crunching over dry leaves and small twigs. Every step felt heavier, not physically, but mentally. I kept thinking about how isolated I was, how far I was from anyone who could help if something went wrong. By late afternoon, I found a clearing that seemed ideal. It was elevated slightly, giving a good view of the surrounding trees, and there was a small stream nearby. I set up my tent, hammered the stakes in carefully, and organized my supplies inside. I collected firewood, trying to find dry pieces, which was harder than it looked. I made a small fire pit with stones I found nearby, arranging them in a circle to contain the flames. As the sun started to dip, I built a modest fire. The warmth and the crackling sound helped me settle down, and for a while, I felt at peace. I had decided to cook some pasta for dinner. I boiled water over the fire in a small metal pot, added the pasta, and stirred it occasionally. I ate slowly, taking in the surroundings. The forest was alive with quiet sounds now: crickets chirping, leaves rustling, an occasional distant bird. The air was cooler than I expected, and the shadows stretched long. After cleaning up, I crawled into my sleeping bag, leaving the fire smoldering, and tried to rest. It wasn't long before I started hearing it, the first sign that something was off. At first, it was subtle, like a twig snapping far off in the darkness. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. But then I heard it again, closer this time. Something was moving near the edge of the clearing. I sat up slowly, straining my eyes. The firelight barely reached the treeline, and I couldn't see anything clearly, just shadows that moved oddly. My heart rate increased. I had always known the forest had predators: bears, coyotes, but this felt different. This felt like it was observing me. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it toward the movement. Nothing, just the swaying branches and the uneven shadows of trees. I felt foolish for being on edge. I reminded myself that I had planned this carefully, that I was trained to handle myself, and that I had a small knife and bear spray in my backpack. Still, the uneasy feeling lingered. The night passed slowly. Every sound seemed amplified: the cracking of dry leaves, the rustling of underbrush. At some point, I thought I heard footsteps approaching the tent, heavy, deliberate. My heart pounded in my chest, and I sat frozen, listening. I could hear my own breathing and the low hiss of the dying fire. I told myself that maybe it was just the wind or a large animal moving around. Eventually, exhaustion overtook fear, and I drifted into an uneasy sleep. I woke in the early hours to the sound of something heavy moving around the perimeter of my campsite. The fire had died completely, leaving me in near darkness. I turned on my flashlight and swept it slowly, carefully, trying not to make any sudden movements. That's when I saw it. A figure crouched near the trees, too large to be an animal, wearing dark clothing that blended into the night. My stomach dropped. I froze, unsure whether to call out, run, or wait. I decided to stay still and assess. It didn't move for what felt like hours, though in reality, it was only a few minutes. Then it took a slow step forward, and I realized it had to be human. The rational part of my mind raced. Why would anyone be here in this isolated part of the forest at this hour? And why was it moving toward me? My first instinct was to grab my knife and bear spray, but I forced myself to remain calm. Panicking would give it an advantage. The figure finally retreated into the shadows after circling the perimeter of the clearing. I stayed motionless, listening, until the rustling stopped entirely. I realized then that this was no ordinary person wandering. This was someone who had been following me, studying me, waiting. The fear was overwhelming, but I knew I had to think clearly. I decided to break camp immediately. I carefully packed the essentials: my knife, flashlight, some food, water, and my sleeping bag. I left the rest, not caring about the lost items. Quietly, I slipped into the trees, trying to stay hidden. Every snap of a twig felt deafening, every shadow a threat. I relied on my map and compass to navigate the terrain. I didn't know where this person had come from or if they were following me, so I tried to move quietly but as fast as possible. Hours passed. The forest seemed endless, the darkness oppressive. At one point, I stumbled over a root and nearly fell, scraping my hand on the rough bark of a tree. Pain flared, but I ignored it, knowing that slowing down could be fatal. I tried to make mental notes of landmarks, streams, and large rocks in case I needed to retrace my steps. The forest was thick, but I knew that if I could reach the main road, I would be safe. Just before dawn, I heard the distant sound of a car engine. My heart leapt. I followed the sound, moving toward the faint light breaking over the treetops. After what felt like hours, I finally stumbled out of the trees and onto a gravel road. My legs were covered in scratches, my hands bruised, but I was alive. I flagged down the first car that came along, explaining as best as I could that I had been alone in the woods and had been followed. The driver looked concerned and called the local ranger station while I sat in the car, trembling. By mid-morning, a ranger vehicle arrived. They searched the area where I had camped and found signs that someone had been there: footprints, broken branches, and other marks indicating someone had moved around my campsite. There were no signs of violence, but it was clear I had narrowly avoided a potentially dangerous encounter. The ranger advised me to stick to well-traveled areas in the future and to always let someone know exactly where I was going. In the following days, I reflected on what had happened. I realized how unprepared I had been for the psychological aspect of being alone in the wilderness. The fear, the tension, the constant awareness of every sound, it had been exhausting, almost paralyzing at times. But I also felt a strange sense of accomplishment. I had survived. I had relied on my instincts, my preparation, and my ability to stay calm under pressure. I returned home with a renewed appreciation for safety and planning. I never camped alone in such an isolated area again. Instead, I chose locations where I could still be close to other people, where help was available if something went wrong. And I made sure to carry my bear spray and a reliable flashlight every time, no matter how short the trip. The experience stayed with me, a reminder of both the beauty and the danger of being in the wild alone. Months later, I heard news that hikers had reported a suspicious person in the same forest, someone who seemed to be watching campsites. The description matched what I had seen. I felt a chill run through me, but I also felt gratitude for having escaped unharmed. I realized that while the forest could be terrifying and unpredictable, careful planning, calm thinking, and respect for the environment could make the difference between danger and safety. I had always liked the quiet of the woods. There was something about leaving the roads and the hum of civilization behind that made me feel both small and alive. It was late summer when I decided to take my first solo camping trip deep into a section of national forest I had only passed by in car trips or short hikes. My plan was simple: hike in, find a good clearing near a small stream, set up camp, and spend a few nights alone with nature. No phone service, no distractions, just me and the forest. I had been careful to plan everything. I checked the weather repeatedly, packed extra food, water, and layers of clothing, and even brought a basic first aid kit, a flashlight, and a small folding knife. I thought I was prepared. I wasn't prepared for what really happened. The first day was perfect. The forest was alive in the morning, with sunlight cutting through the canopy in long gold streaks. Birds sang in the distance, and the occasional deer would dart past me, pausing only briefly to assess my presence before disappearing again. I followed an old trail for a few miles, taking notes of landmarks in case I needed to retrace my steps. By mid-afternoon, I found a small clearing near a stream with clear, running water. It was secluded enough that I wouldn't be disturbed by other hikers, but not so far from the trail that I would get lost completely. I set up my small tent on a slightly elevated patch of ground, making sure it was safe from potential flooding if the rain came. I collected some dry wood for a fire and set about unpacking my supplies. Everything seemed fine. As evening approached, I built a small fire and sat by it, watching the sun dip behind the trees. The air turned cooler, and I felt that comforting isolation that I had been seeking. I cooked a simple meal of rice and canned beans, cleaned up carefully, and crawled into my sleeping bag, thinking I would fall asleep easily with the sound of the stream beside me. It started with the noises. I had expected the forest to be alive at night, but that night it felt different. At first, it was the faint snapping of twigs, something I attributed to small animals moving through the underbrush. Then, a rustling that seemed closer, almost as if something was circling my tent. I tried to calm myself, thinking it was likely a raccoon or a deer. The problem was that the sounds didn't feel random, they were deliberate, moving in a pattern around the clearing. My heart started racing, but I told myself it was normal. Animals are cautious. I had nothing to fear. I laid still, listening. The rustling stopped. Then a heavier sound, footsteps, deliberate, slow, almost careful, came from the direction of the trees. I froze. My flashlight was inside the tent, just out of reach. My mind raced through possibilities. Other campers? Hikers lost in the dark? A hunter? Then I remembered I had seen no one all day. I had passed no one on the trail, and the clearing had been empty. I knew I had to act. Slowly, silently, I reached for my knife, keeping my breathing low. I unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. The firelight cast a small glow on the edge of the clearing, but I could see nothing moving. My eyes adjusted to the dark. I strained to hear. The footsteps had stopped. The forest was quiet again, except for the sound of the stream and the occasional night bird. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, that my imagination was getting the best of me. I crawled back into the sleeping bag, but sleep was impossible. Every small noise, every gust of wind, made me jump. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time felt warped in the dark. At some point, I must have dozed, because I woke with a start to the sound of my fire sputtering. I sat up, heart in my throat. Smoke curled lazily from the embers, and the wood had shifted. My fire was almost out, and with it, my small circle of light in the dark. Then I heard it clearly, a voice, or something like a voice, a low, muffled sound, like someone whispering just at the edge of hearing. I had told myself there would be no one near, and yet, there it was. Not words exactly, but a sound meant to convey presence. Someone or something was out there. The rational part of my brain tried to tell me it was an animal or the wind, but I knew better. The sound was deliberate. I grabbed my flashlight and opened the tent fully, sweeping the beam across the clearing. Nothing. The light landed on the trees, the underbrush, and the stream. No movement. I shone it across the clearing again and froze. There were footprints in the dirt around my tent. Large human footprints. Someone had circled the clearing while I slept, leaving marks in the soft earth. My stomach turned. Whoever it was, they had been close. I knew I had to leave. I couldn't stay here, but leaving in the dark, in the forest, meant getting lost, and getting lost at night could be worse than staying. I debated for what felt like hours, keeping the flashlight sweeping in all directions, listening to the faint sounds of movement in the shadows. Finally, I made my decision. I would pack silently and move along the stream. Water always leads somewhere, and I hoped I would find another trail or clearing with some chance of encountering people. I moved quietly, packing my tent and gear as fast as possible without making noise. Every step I took, I listened. I felt like eyes were on me from the dark, tracking my movements. By the time I was ready to move, the moon had risen, casting enough light for me to see a few feet ahead. I slipped out of the clearing and began following the stream. First, it was slow going. The forest floor was uneven, and my backpack weighed heavily. I stumbled once, catching myself before falling, and the sound echoed unnaturally loud in the quiet. I imagined shadows moving, imagined someone following just out of sight, but I kept moving. I followed the stream, thinking of nothing but getting to safety. Hours passed. The forest changed subtly as I moved downstream. Trees grew taller, underbrush denser. The stream curved and split in places, forcing me to make decisions without a map. I tried to mark my path with small piles of stones, hoping that if I had to turn back, I could find my way. My legs ached, my arms burned from carrying the pack, and the adrenaline that had kept me moving began to fade. Around what I guessed was midnight or maybe closer to 1 a.m., I finally saw something that made my blood run cold. Another set of footprints, human, fresh, leading directly along the edge of the stream. They were different from mine, bigger, heavier, and the spacing between them suggested someone was moving fast. I froze, heart hammering, and waited. Nothing happened for a few minutes. The forest remained silent, except for the faint gurgle of the stream. Then a snap, a branch somewhere up ahead. Not close, but close enough to know someone or something was moving toward me. I didn't wait. I ran. I ran as fast as I could along the uneven stream bank, trying to ignore the sharp stones cutting into my boots and the roots that threatened to trip me. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't know if I would find safety. I just ran. Hours later, though it felt like days, I saw a faint glow through the trees. At first, I thought it was the moonlight on rocks, but as I got closer, I realized it was a fire. Someone had set up a legitimate campsite. Relief hit me in waves, but so did caution. I approached slowly, keeping low, scanning for any threat. Eventually, I realized it was not one person, it was a small group of campers, probably 4 or 5 people. They were speaking, laughing quietly, the normal sounds of a group at ease in the woods. I approached the fire and explained my situation as best as I could. They were shocked, obviously, but helpful. One of them lent me some food and water. Another offered to guide me back toward the main trail. My relief was profound. By the first light of dawn, I was back on a marked trail with my temporary rescuers, exhausted, dehydrated, and shaken but safe. After I returned home, I thought endlessly about what had happened. There was no supernatural force, no ghost, no fairy tale monster. It was someone, probably a criminal, someone who had been tracking people in the woods, looking for an opportunity. I had been lucky. I remember the morning we left for that trip with perfect clarity. The sky was gray but promising, the kind of gray that makes the air smell damp and sharp. I had my backpack ready, heavy with supplies. A tent, sleeping bag, cooking gear, water, extra clothes, and the small first aid kit I insisted on bringing. I had spent days planning the route, studying the maps, marking spots for water, potential campsites, and places to avoid. I wasn't careless. I liked to think I was meticulous. That confidence would be tested in ways I hadn't imagined. We drove for hours on a winding road, the kind where trees crowd both sides of the asphalt, creating shadows that moved as the sun shifted. The radio crackled and cut in and out, the signal weak as we went deeper into the forested stretch. Eventually, the road turned into gravel, and then nothing more than a faint dirt track that seemed to disappear under overgrown bushes. At this point, the car seemed swallowed by the forest itself, and the world beyond was gone. It was the kind of isolation that feels quiet at first, almost peaceful, until you realize the quiet is total. There is no background noise from civilization, just your own breathing, your steps, and the wind in the leaves. We parked the car in a small clearing near a stream. The ground was soft, damp, and slightly uneven. I checked the GPS again, noting the coordinates of our campsite. I wanted to be sure we could find our way back, but it had been a long time since I felt truly uneasy in the woods. The feeling crept over me as I started unloading the gear, a subtle weight in my stomach that didn't make sense. The sky had darkened slightly, though it was only early afternoon. There was no storm forecast, but the air smelled wet, like rain could fall at any moment. Setting up camp was tedious but necessary. The tent had to be pitched on relatively flat ground. I examined the area, noticing subtle signs I hadn't seen at first. Fallen branches that looked broken unnaturally, leaves that had been crushed recently, footprints that were too small to be human but too large for any animal I could recognize. I brushed it off initially, thinking it was a deer or a raccoon, but there was something off about them. They didn't follow a normal animal pattern. Something about the spacing and the weight distribution was wrong. We settled near the stream, letting the sound of running water provide a sense of comfort. I unpacked the stove, lit it carefully, and began preparing our first meal. The forest around us seemed alive with movement, shadows flitting in the corner of my eye. I caught myself staring into the trees, feeling like we were being watched. Every snap of a twig made me jump, and each time I dismissed it as an animal. Yet the feeling persisted, growing heavier as the day went on. By late afternoon, clouds had thickened. The sun's weak light struggled through the canopy, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally. I made sure we had plenty of water and firewood before night fell. I always thought of camping as an adventure, a break from routine life, but I had underestimated just how quickly things could feel threatening when you were truly alone. Night arrived faster than I expected. Darkness in the forest is absolute. There are no streetlights, no neon signs, no faint glow of houses. The only light comes from the fire we managed to build, which crackled and spat sparks into the air. I sat close to it, careful not to burn myself, listening. The stream babbled nearby, but all other sounds were sharp, sudden, and unfamiliar. Every rustle of leaves made me tense. Every distant sound made my heart rate spike. I kept glancing at the shadows beyond the firelight. Sometimes I thought I saw figures moving in the darkness, just on the edge of vision, too fast to identify. I tried to sleep, but the sounds of the forest made it impossible. Every snapping branch, every distant growl, made me sit upright in my sleeping bag. Around midnight, I heard something more distinct. Footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, heavier than a deer, but lighter than a bear. They weren't running. They circled around our camp, just outside the light of the fire. My stomach sank. I checked the tent, making sure zippers were closed, shaking my head, trying to convince myself it was an animal. But the steps were too controlled, too precise, and the pauses between them too long. Someone or something was watching us. I stayed awake the entire night, barely able to relax. Morning brought some relief, but not much. The footsteps had disappeared, leaving no trace. We packed up quickly, eager to leave, and I decided to take the main trail back to the car, avoiding the areas that had seemed to hold the strange signs. But the forest, once familiar, now felt alien. Every tree looked the same. Every fork in the trail was confusing. I began to notice that the trail markers I had studied didn't match what I was seeing. Somehow, the map and reality had diverged. By midday, we had lost the trail completely. We had no choice but to keep moving, hoping to find the road. The forest had a way of swallowing the sun. By 2 p.m., the air had grown colder, damp, and heavy. My water was running low, my stomach was empty, and the realization that we might not find our way out started to sink in. Panic tried to creep in, but I forced myself to think logically. We had supplies, and I knew basic survival skills. Find water, find shelter, stay calm. Late in the afternoon, we stumbled upon a makeshift clearing. It wasn't marked on any map. The ground was trampled, and there were remnants of old campfires. I noticed footprints, and this time they were unmistakably human. They circled the area in a haphazard way, as if someone had been moving around, waiting. My mind raced. Had people been here recently? Were they still nearby? I remembered the sounds from the night before. It wasn't just an animal. The sun began to set as I realized we needed shelter quickly. The remnants of the clearing gave us enough wood to start a fire, and we set up a makeshift lean-to using fallen branches. Night fell, and with it came a deeper, more suffocating darkness. The forest became alive in an entirely new way. Branches snapped under invisible weight, and shadows seemed to shift against the firelight. At one point, I glimpsed movement fast, deliberate, and low to the ground at the edge of the firelight. My heart thudded in my chest. We survived the night by taking turns watching. Sleep was almost impossible. Every small noise, every shift in the leaves, every distant snap was analyzed, feared, and remembered. At dawn, I made a decision. We needed to move quickly, stay on the go, and find the road. We followed a faint creek downhill, thinking water might lead to civilization. Hours passed and our exhaustion grew. Hunger and dehydration made every step feel heavier, every sound sharper. By mid-afternoon, the forest finally began to thin. The oppressive feeling of being watched eased slightly. Eventually, we emerged onto a narrow gravel road, overgrown but clearly used at some point. Relief washed over me. I checked the GPS and confirmed our location. We were miles from the intended campsite, but close enough to find a proper road leading back to civilization. My limbs were sore, my body weak, but the overwhelming feeling was relief. We followed the road, and by evening we saw headlights in the distance. I waved frantically. The vehicle slowed, and eventually, a friendly driver stopped to help. They gave us water and directions to the nearest town. I felt safe again, the tension of the past 2 days lifting. By nightfall, we were back in a motel, showered, fed, and resting. I kept thinking about the forest. How easily it could have swallowed us. How quickly isolation had turned everything familiar into something threatening, and how close we had come to disaster. The trip changed me. I realized that planning, maps, and survival knowledge are important, but sometimes the unpredictability of nature, combined with human presence, can create a danger no one expects. I still go camping occasionally, but never without checking every detail twice, never without leaving clear markers of my path, and never underestimating the quiet, patient threat of isolation. I had been planning this solo camping trip for months. I needed it a break from the endless noise of the city, the constant pressure at work, the faces and voices that seemed to follow me even in my dreams. I wanted a place where the air was sharp and clean, where I could walk for hours without seeing another person, and where I could be forced to rely on myself, to be aware of every step, every sound. I found a trail deep in the mountains that promised isolation, a route that was rarely traveled and barely maintained. The directions were simple but vague. Follow the river, then a ridge, then a loop back to a clearing where I could set up camp. I made a mental note to start early, to bring extra water, and to pack my headlamp, even though I thought I wouldn't need it in the first night. I left the city in the gray hours before sunrise, driving through quiet towns and empty highways. The air grew colder as I climbed, and the road narrowed and twisted, passing through thick pine forests that blocked out the weak morning light. By the time I reached the parking area at the trailhead, the sun was just above the horizon, its light filtering in golden beams through the trees. I unloaded my backpack and double-checked my gear. Tent, sleeping bag, first aid kit, water, food, map, compass, knife, flashlight, extra batteries. Everything seemed in order. I started on the trail, feeling the crunch of dirt and fallen needles beneath my boots. The forest quiet except for distant bird calls and the occasional rustle of leaves. At first, the hike was peaceful. The trail followed a narrow river, the water clear and cold, tumbling over rocks and roots. I stopped occasionally to take photographs or to refill my water bottle. I noticed the details, the moss-covered stones, The way the light hit the mist over the river, the small insects flitting across the water's surface. Everything felt untouched, but as the day wore on, the trail became less defined. The path narrowed into a barely visible line between thick underbrush, and the sound of the river grew distant. I checked my map and compass. I was still on course, but the isolation began to sink in. There were no other hikers, no signs of human presence, just the forest and me. By mid-afternoon, I reached the ridge the trail had promised. The elevation made the air colder, and the wind cut through my jacket. The view was incredible, mountains layered one after the other, the valleys cloaked in mist, the sun slanting low in the sky. I found a flat area with enough space for my tent, and I decided this would be my camp for the night. I set up the tent, laid out my sleeping bag, and gathered wood for a fire. By the time the fire was crackling, the sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the sky with shades of orange and red. I cooked a simple meal of canned beans and rice over the fire, savoring the warmth and the quiet. As darkness fell, the forest changed. The sounds of birds vanished, replaced by the occasional snap of a twig or rustle of leaves. The wind in the trees grew sharper, carrying the scent of wet earth and pine. I felt a shiver run down my spine, but I told myself it was just the cold. I checked my supplies and decided to rest early, crawling into my sleeping bag with the fire dying down to embers. I could see the faint glimmer of stars through the trees, and at first, I felt calm, even at peace. Then I heard it, a noise that didn't belong. At first, I tried to dismiss it, a branch falling, an animal moving, but it was rhythmic, deliberate. A low scrape against the forest floor, followed by another. I froze, straining to hear. The sound came closer, slow and steady. My heart rate spiked, and I sat up slightly in my sleeping bag. I had a flashlight, but I didn't want to draw attention or startle whatever it was. The fire had gone out, and the darkness seemed to press against the tent. The noise stopped for a moment, then started again, this time closer, as if something large was moving carefully toward me. I considered my options. I could stay put, wait, and hope it was just an animal. I could leave the tent and run down the ridge to the safety of the lower trail, but the steep slope and darkness made that dangerous. I decided to stay in the tent for now, quietly reaching for my knife and tucking it within easy reach. The scrape continued, circling my camp, slow and deliberate, stopping now and then as if whatever it was assessing me. My mind raced. Bears, cougars, something else entirely? I had read that cougars could be silent hunters, and bears, though usually avoidant of humans, could be aggressive if they sensed food. I tried to control my breathing, listening, waiting. Hours passed like this. Every rustle, every crack of a branch made me jump. I thought I saw shadows through the thin fabric of the tent, shapes moving between the trees. I didn't sleep. Dawn was far off, and I couldn't let my guard down. At one point, the noises stopped completely, leaving only the sound of my own heartbeat. I debated leaving the tent to light a new fire, but I knew that moving in the open could be dangerous if a predator was near. I stayed huddled inside, holding my knife, eyes wide, muscles tense. Eventually, I realized the creature or whatever had been moving around me had retreated. The first light of dawn broke through the trees, painting the forest in soft colors. I cautiously unzipped the tent, flashlight ready. Everything seemed normal. No prints in the soil, no broken branches, no signs of a struggle. I didn't know if it had been a bear, a cougar, or some other animal, but I didn't want to find out. I decided to pack up immediately and descend the ridge. The forest, so beautiful in the morning light, now seemed treacherous, full of hidden dangers. As I moved down the trail, I took care to make noise, stomping on twigs, clapping my hands to let any animals know I was there. I avoided thick brush where something could hide, keeping to open sections where I could see far ahead. I moved quickly but cautiously, adrenaline keeping me alert, my senses on edge. The ridge was steep and the path slippery in places, but I navigated it carefully, checking my footing and making sure my backpack was secure. Hours later, I reached the river trail again. Hearing the water was a relief. I followed it back toward the parking area, my legs aching, my body exhausted from the tension of the night. Along the way, I spotted small signs of wildlife deer tracks, birds hopping from branch to branch, but nothing threatening. The morning sun grew higher, warming my back, and I felt the tight knot of fear in my chest begin to loosen. When I finally reached my car, I leaned against it, taking deep breaths. The relief was overwhelming. I was tired, sore, but alive. I double-checked my gear one last time and started the engine, driving slowly down the winding mountain road. The city appeared in the distance, familiar and crowded, and I felt a strange mix of comfort and disappointment. I had come seeking solitude, danger, and self-reliance, and I had found it. The fear had been real, the tension tangible, and I had survived it. Later, when I reflected on the trip, I realized how easily things could have gone wrong. One wrong step on the ridge, one encounter too close with a predator, and it could have ended badly. But I had learned valuable lessons. Respect the wilderness, be prepared, and never underestimate the power of alertness and caution. The experience left me both shaken and stronger, a reminder that survival is often about patience, awareness, and careful decision-making. I promised myself I would return someday, better prepared, more knowledgeable, and still seeking the raw, unfiltered challenge of being completely alone in the wild. And in the end, that night of terror became more than just fear. It became a lesson in humility, in vigilance, and in the quiet strength that comes from facing the unknown and making it back safely. I had been tested and I had survived. That clarity, that absolute certainty that I could trust my instincts and judgment, stayed with me long after I left the mountains, shaping the way I approached risk, adventure, and life itself. I had been planning this solo camping trip for months. My work schedule had been brutal, leaving me drained and craving solitude. The idea of being completely alone in the wilderness, with nothing but my gear and my own thoughts, sounded perfect. I had chosen a national forest a few hours' drive from my city, a place I had hiked before, though never for more than a single day. The forest had dense tree cover, a few small streams, and a handful of primitive campsites. I picked one that was remote, near a bend in a river, far enough from the main trail that I expected few people would stumble upon me. I arrived late in the afternoon, carrying my backpack that was heavier than I liked to admit. It contained my tent, sleeping bag, stove, water, food, extra clothes, and a first aid kit. The sun was already dipping toward the horizon, turning the sky shades of orange and pink. I set up my tent on a flat patch of earth that was mostly clear of rocks and roots, close enough to the river to hear its gentle murmur, but far enough to avoid getting wet if the level rose overnight. I was methodical with my setup, making sure the tent was taut, the rainfly secure, and the stakes firmly in the ground. After unpacking, I gathered firewood from nearby fallen branches. The dry wood snapped under my hands, and I could smell the pine and earth as I carried it to my site. I cleared a circle for the fire pit, placing stones around it to contain the flames. I checked the wind direction to avoid smoke blowing into the tent. By the time I struck the match and coaxed the fire into life, the sun had disappeared behind the treeline, leaving a dim, fading light. Shadows stretched between the trunks, growing darker as the night approached. I sat near the fire, the warmth seeping into my legs through my pants. I cooked a simple meal, instant rice with a pouch of seasoned tuna. The aroma made my stomach tighten in hunger, and I ate slowly, savoring each bite. Around me, the forest was alive with sounds. the occasional rustle of leaves, distant bird calls, the whisper of the river. The natural noises were comforting at first, a reminder I was not entirely alone, yet entirely safe. After dinner, I extinguished the stove and stoked the fire just enough to keep it burning. I knew I would need it through the early hours. Darkness had fallen fully now. The fire cast dancing light on the surrounding trees, flickering across the rough bark and the undergrowth. I lay on my back, gazing at the night sky between the gaps in the branches, and for a while, everything was peaceful. The forest had a rhythm, and I felt a deep, grounding calm. Then I heard it, a faint snapping of twigs from the direction of the river. I froze, listening carefully. The snapping continued intermittently, soft at first, then a little louder, closer. My heart rate picked up. I told myself it was probably a deer or some other small animal. Bears were not common here, at least not in the lower elevations where I had set up. Yet the sound was too deliberate, too rhythmic to be random wandering. It sounded like someone or something was moving carefully but steadily through the underbrush. I reached for my flashlight, switching it on to scan the tree-line near the river. The beam caught on a branch, but there was nothing visible. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. I tried to calm myself, reasoning that animals often make noises that seem human or deliberate in the dark. Still, the snapping continued, accompanied now by a subtle crunching sound, like someone walking on dry leaves. I stood, keeping the fire between me and the forest, and slowly began to make my way toward my tent, my flashlight in one hand and a small pocket knife in the other. I was acutely aware of every sound, every leaf, every shift of shadow. The snapping stopped abruptly. Silence descended, heavy and unnatural. My breath became loud in my ears, and I felt exposed, more than I had in hours of being alone here. I decided to retreat to the tent, making sure the entrance faced the fire. I zipped myself inside, leaving a small gap for ventilation but keeping my knife within reach. I laid my backpack in front of me, thinking I could use it as a buffer if anything approached. My mind raced with possibilities, none of them pleasant. Person could be out here armed or not. Or perhaps a large animal had been drawn by the fire and smell of food. I turned on a small headlamp inside the tent and tried to listen carefully, but there was nothing. Only the river and the wind through the trees. Hours passed. I dared not sleep fully, dozing in fits, waking at every sound. I could hear branches breaking far away, leaves rustling, even faint water splashes in the river. Occasionally, I thought I heard footsteps circling the campsite, but when I shone the flashlight outside, there was nothing. My fire had burned low, and I fed it small sticks to keep it alive. By the time the first hint of dawn appeared, a thin, gray light seeping through the treetops, I was exhausted, mentally and physically drained. The forest seemed to relax as light spread, and the fear that had gripped me through the night began to subside. I decided to pack up. I wanted to leave this campsite as quickly as possible, feeling that staying even one more night was unwise. I carefully rolled up my sleeping bag and tent, making sure no gear was left behind. My food supplies were already reduced from the previous night, and I collected the remaining firewood, not wanting to leave evidence of my presence. Every sound still made me jump, but the visibility of daylight gave me a sense of safety. I hiked back toward the main trail slowly, constantly scanning the trees and underbrush. The forest in daylight was very different, less menacing, more open. Birds called out in the branches, insects buzzed around my face, and the sunlight formed patterns on the forest floor. I felt a creeping awareness of how vulnerable I had been, how easily a human or animal could have harmed me during the night. I also realized I had made mistakes. I hadn't secured food far enough from the tent. I had underestimated the possibility of other people or animals being nearby, and I had let the darkness play tricks on my perception. When I reached my car, parked several miles from the campsite, I breathed a deep sigh of relief. The engine started without issue, and I drove slowly back to civilization, still hyper-aware of every shadow along the road. By the time I reached my apartment, I felt like I had aged years in just a single night. I unpacked my gear, noting that nothing had been stolen or damaged. The thought was comforting and frustrating at the same time. I had survived the night without injury, but the fear and tension lingered in my muscles and mind. Over the next few days, I reflected on the experience. I realized that camping alone required far more preparation than I had given it. I needed to be more cautious with site selection, food storage, and situational awareness. I also learned how quickly fear could amplify ordinary sounds in nature, turning harmless animals and branches into something sinister. The experience left me both shaken and wiser. Months later, I returned to the same forest, but I did not go alone. I went with a friend, carefully selecting a well-known campsite with good visibility and no nearby water hazards. The lessons I had learned from that first night preparation, vigilance, and respect for the wilderness made the second trip calm and enjoyable. I could now appreciate the forest fully, knowing that fear, when tempered by knowledge and caution, could be controlled. That night, under the stars, I cooked a small meal, listened to the river, and slept through the darkness peacefully, finally free from the terror that had haunted me during my first solo camping trip. From that experience, I carry a respect for the wilderness that is practical and grounded. I understand the importance of preparation and awareness. I learned that the fear of the unknown is real, but it can be managed with careful planning and cautious action. Most importantly, I learned that leaving the forest with all senses alert, yet alive and unharmed, is a victory in itself. I never camped alone again without proper backup, signaling devices, and thorough knowledge of the area.